Hey YouTube, I'm Tall Nerd. Welcome back once again, and today, I am so excited. You see, recently I read an article about Elon Musk and a lot of the plans that he has for outer space and other things. And like the very first line, or one of the first lines in the article, says that, while he's very focused on going to Mars and sending humans to Mars for the very first time ever, he also wants to put a permanent human habitation on the moon. And maybe it's just me, but when I read that, it sounded like they were saying that building a moon base and going to Mars were two separate entities. Like those were two separate ideas that had nothing to do with each other. And that's not true. It simply isn't. Going to the moon and leaving humans there is very important for going to Mars. And it might even be critically important depending on how you want to do it. And I'm going to explain why. So the first and most obvious answer for why a moon base is important for going to Mars is that it's developing a lot of the same sorts of technology. Rocket technology, habitations, all those kinds of things, but in a much closer setting where we can test them, without spending 6 months getting there. But there's another reason, a big one. And I'm going to get into that, but really it's very tightly intertwined with two big questions about a moon base, which is why and how. Why do we want to build one? Why should we build one? And how would we actually build it? So I'm going to explain all of these things as I'm going. First, let me talk a little bit about the how, or really the challenges that make that how a very difficult question. Because you see, building a moon base would be hard. It would be extremely hard for a number of reasons. But some of the first ones that spring to mind for me are, well, okay, first of all, what are we going to make it out of? And how are we going to get those building materials there? Most building materials like concrete or steel that we use here on Earth are heavy, and weight is the absolute worst enemy of space travel due to something called the rocket equation, which, without getting too technical with it, basically says that for every pound of stuff that you want to send into space, you need about 6 pounds of fuel. But each of those 6 pounds requires another 6 pounds of fuel, and then this is why rockets get really, really, really big. So the lighter that you can make your rocket, the better. The lighter, the less stuff that you have to send, the better. But building buildings takes a lot of stuff. So where are we going to get that from? How are we going to send it to the moon? And then how are humans going to live there? How are we going to get oxygen? How are we going to get water? Or how are we going to get food? Water especially is really heavy. Again, that's a problem. We can't send heavy stuff. If we do, it will just cost so much more money. According to NASA, it costs about $10,000 per pound to put something in orbit. Not on the moon, in orbit. So that racks up very, very fast. So we need to keep this light. So how? How are we going to do that? Those are really difficult questions that we have to answer. And technology is ultimately the key. I'll come back to that in a minute. But first, let me jump over to the why of why we should go to the moon, because that's the first question that really comes to everybody's mind. Well, why? What's the point? Why should we do that? We've been to the moon. It's no big deal, right? Okay, first of all, wrong. Space travel is incredibly difficult. There is a tiny margin for error every time we try to send something into space. Going to the moon is no small feat at all. Second, as a giant space nerd, it really bugs me whenever people ask, well, why should we do that? Because to me it seems so obvious. Going to the moon and putting a permanent human residence there, or going and sending people to Mars, will push the boundaries and the limits of human technology and science more than so many other things that we're doing right now. I mean, just going to the moon resulted in huge leaps forward for science and technology, and it's the same with this. So that alone should be enough of a why, but I know that it isn't for a lot of people, because when people say, well, why should we go to the moon, or why should we go to Mars, the question that they're really asking is, why should we spend the money? What is the economic reasoning for doing that. And fair enough, people are worried about money. So let's talk about money for a little bit. Now, there are a lot of important elements and minerals on the moon that we could find incredibly useful, but I just want to highlight a handful of them very quickly. First of all, helium-3. This is kind of the big one that I feel like I see people bring up a lot, or at least bring up first. And it's understandable because helium-3 is pretty rare on Earth and could provide fuel for nuclear fusion reactors, which could provide tons of energy. And more energy is a good thing. Energy that doesn't rely on fossil fuels is an amazing thing. Then again, sending something to the moon to get fuel to provide electricity here is kind of counterproductive, but it does mean that we could potentially fuel nuclear reactors on the moon and provide power to everything there fairly easily. Second, there's a lot of water on the moon, as it turns out. Kind of. There are places where it's frozen. There are a lot of places where it's bound into rocks and things like that. But if we can get it out, we could break it down into oxygen that we could breathe. We could potentially be able to drink it if there's enough of it, if it is in sufficient quantities, which I'm guessing it is. And also really importantly, we could break it down and work with it and turn it into rocket fuel. That's going to be super important in a minute. I'll get back to that. But quickly, the third natural resource that could be really important on the moon is regolith, which, okay, that's a fancy word for moon dirt. The stuff that's just everywhere, all over the moon. It actually contains a ton of really useful compounds. It has a bunch of oxygen, a bunch of silicon, and a whole bunch of iron. And it can be processed into a lot of different shapes and forms and materials. You can build, roads or concrete or buildings out of just the dirt that's already on the moon, which, jumping back from why to how for a second, all of a sudden, a lot of those problems that I brought up earlier are kind of disappearing, because if we can liberate oxygen and water from the surface of the moon, and we can use regolith as a building material, all of a sudden we don't have to take stuff with us. It's already there. We just have to figure out how to liberate it from where it is. But anyway, I will get back to that in a minute. I know I'm being kind of crazy here, but just stick with me. So going back to why we need a moon base for Mars missions. Let's just assume that manned Mars missions, are going to happen, because they are. So our focus should be on how can we make them cheap. Very, very simple. I mentioned a few minutes ago that it costs $10,000 to put a pound of payload into orbit around the Earth. That's cool, but what a lot of people, or what is rather really easy to forget, is that that's not just the stuff that we want to land wherever we're going to land. That's also the fuel that it takes to get from orbit to Mars or the moon or wherever else. And that can be a lot of fuel. I mean, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of pounds of the stuff. And when you're spending $10,000 for each pound of that, it adds up really, really quickly. But what if we didn't have to bring all of that fuel with us? What if we could just take a rocket, send it up, and have it designed so that it can only make it into orbit around the Earth? Well, I know what you're thinking. That's not very useful if you're trying to go to Mars. You're right. But what if we had a gas station in orbit around the Earth? And I'm being serious here. I mentioned a minute ago that there are materials on the moon, especially the water that's bound up in rocks and stuff, that we can turn into rocket fuel. What if we take that and put it in giant tankers in orbit around the Earth so that we can refuel up there and send less of it from the ground? All of a sudden, you're sending much, much lighter rockets into orbit, which means you're saving tons of money. How much money, though, is the question, or at least it's the question that I wanted to answer, because I started jumping into this and got so fascinated about all of this. I was incredibly excited about it. So I did some math and I broke it down. And I found out that for the Mars Curiosity rover, if we had sent it with just enough fuel to get into orbit and then had refueled it there to then go to Mars and land, we would have saved $300 million. Yep, $300 million. Based on the $10,000 per pound that we talked about earlier. And that's a ton of money, but let's talk bigger than that, because a manned mission to Mars would be way bigger than that. So much bigger. Especially because you have to get home, which includes tons more material for the ship and way more fuel. So let's talk about the biggest rocket that mankind has ever produced, the Saturn V. This is the rocket that sent humans to the moon. And so it's, it's not perfect. It will be significantly smaller than a rocket going to Mars. But let's just go with that. If we had used an orbiting gas station, for lack of a better term, with the Saturn V, with the Apollo missions that went to the moon, we would have saved, and I can't believe this number is this big, $1.35 billion per mission. It's $1.35 billion with a B for Apollo 11, and then another $1.35 billion for Apollo 12 and 13, 14, 15. Oh my gosh, that's a ton of money. We're talking just for the Apollo missions, roughly $10 billion saved, or nearly that much. That's a ton. I don't know if that's enough money to build a moon base with, but some people say that actually it might be. I've seen estimates from $10 billion all the way up to 70 or 80 or hundreds of billions of dollars. But that's not the point. The point is that you can save boatloads of money by having your gas already in space waiting for you there. And that's going to be enormously important for a mission to Mars. All right, so there you go. That's the reason. That's why we need a moon base to help us with our Mars missions. Because that way we can use smaller rockets, and that way we can, save a lot of money. And saving money is good, and smaller rockets tend to be less complicated. Although, speaking of complicated, I understand that these estimates are, let's say I'm taking a lot of liberties. I'm simplifying the problem by a lot. I mean, a lot of these rockets are not designed to fly empty. At least not when they're being launched initially from Earth. You would have to re-engineer the rockets a bunch. But that's not the point. The point is that there's a huge potential for saving money here, and that's why we need to build a moon base. And how are we going to build that moon base? Yes, I'm getting back to this question. As we've already established, you can build a moon base with stuff that's already on the moon. We can get iron and make steel, or we can build concrete out of regolith. We can potentially liberate oxygen and water from the minerals that are already there on the moon. We have everything we need. So, how do we build a moon base? By sending robots. That's really all there is to it. Robots that can harvest the materials that are there, robots that can process those materials into building materials and into, all of the useful stuff that humans will need, and robots that can construct structures out of those materials. If we do that, then all of a sudden, the first astronauts who are going to live on the moon for an extended period of time, they can just go and show up, and all of a sudden, it's there. It's just already ready for them. Now, I admit that is a bit of a pipe dream. In all likelihood, those astronauts would still have to do a bunch of extra setting up, and, robots aren't perfect and all that. But it's a feasible idea. It's something that we could do. And so, all of a sudden, researching this, I found that it's not actually as far off as I would have expected. All right, with that is everything that I have for you today. Please let me know in the comments what you think about building a moon base or going to Mars, and especially let me know if I got something wrong, because that is definitely a possibility. I'm not a specialist here. But hey, please like, comment, and subscribe if you like anything that I said today. I will keep talking about nerdy space stuff and nerdy stuff in general. But until next time, please have a great day.